everyone. Welcome to another edition of Critical Conversations, where we discuss hot topic issues related to the Muslim world. Today, we will try and understand the current climate of Islamophobia by examining religious intolerance in the U.S. from a historical perspective. To help us do that, we are joined in our studio by Dr. Peter Gottschalk, author of the groundbreaking book, American Heretics: Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and the History of Religious Intolerance. This book explores various moments of antagonism against various religious groups in the U.S. and explores the dynamics of both intolerance and pluralism. Peter Gottschalk is Professor of Religion at Wesleyan University. He received his BA in History at the College of the Holy Cross, his MA in South Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and his PhD in the History of Religions from the University of Chicago. Peter's research and teaching concentrate on the dynamics of cultural interpretation and conflict in the context of Islam, Hindu traditions, and the West. His books have been reviewed in the Times Literary Supplement and the New York Times. He has appeared on Voice of America, Air America, and National Public Radio, and his work has been mentioned in USA Today, the LA Times, and the On Faith website, formerly of the Washington Post. Dr. Gottschalk, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in your book, American Heretics, you challenge the notion that America is a bastion of religious tolerance, or has been a bastion of religious tolerance, and show that various religious groups, from Quakers to Jews to Catholics, have throughout American history been persecuted at various moments. Before we get into the causes of religious discrimination of these particular groups, let's talk about what led you to actually start this or undertake this project, and why is it important in your mind to revisit some of the unsavory moments in U.S. history with respect to religious intolerance?
So I came to this project in part because of a variety of different experiences that I've had in my life regarding religion and religious intolerance, both as somebody who was raised Catholic in the United States and as somebody who has been involved in doing research about Muslim communities both in India and Pakistan as well as in the United States. And so it was just clear that in terms of Islamophobia today, that if we're really going to understand what's going on, we can't just put it in terms of today. Because too often it's assumed that Islamophobia today really comes out of the events, the tragedies of 9/11, or maybe they come from the 1983 or from the 1979 Iranian Revolution. But in fact, the origins go farther back than that. And there are, as you said, there are other instances of religious discrimination in the United States. And it's not as though there aren't also very strong traditions of religious tolerance and pluralism for which Americans should be rightfully proud. But to really understand the history, the Americans really have to understand the fuller picture, in which there are some moments when definitely there is not reason for pride.
And what was your own, having been raised here in the U.S., if you don't mind me asking, what is your own particular sort of religious, background, and how have you felt about, have you ever experienced discrimination?
Well, I was raised Catholic and in a kind of overwhelmingly Protestant part of New Jersey, but I can't say that I really felt any kind of active discrimination toward me. But on the other hand, I had a particular experience in my life in which I was talking to a friend of mine who was, he was referencing something that was seemingly quite uncontroversial. And I said something and he replied and said, "Oh, well, of course you would say that because you're Catholic." Oh. And he self-identified as Lutheran, and he came from a part of Iowa that was known to have some Catholic-Lutheran differences. Sometimes some towns are known to be Lutheran towns or primarily Lutheran, some are primarily Catholic, and so they trade suspicions about one another. And I was just so taken aback because this was somebody I knew well, I considered a friend, and for him to suddenly reduce my perspective on an issue that I didn't see to be religious at all and not really informed by my Catholic upbringing at all, really took me aback. And so it gave me a small amount of sympathy, at least, for religious groups that suffer far worse forms of discrimination than what I had suffered.
Sure. And so what are some of the causes of religious intolerance? I mean, while the circumstances surrounding each group that you have sort of mentioned in your book or talked about, whether Catholics or Jews, Quakers, the circumstances surrounding the persecution might be different, but was there a common thread that emerged, sort of that was perhaps common to these groups that caused this intolerance?
I think what certainly is a common thread is a lack of understanding by the groups that are the victimizers. Very often there might be reasons for some sort of friction between different communities, and that might be on a very local level, but then in many of the instances that I explored, they became a national issue or at least a regional issue, because some outsiders were reading the religious group as posing a far greater threat, or even a threat that they didn't actually pose. And we see that repeatedly today as well, where very local events suddenly get blown out into being national events because of these kinds of fears.
Right. So, I mean, let's take the example of Catholics. I mean, what was about, Catholics that, subjected them to suspicion and discrimination and persecution?
Right. So that's the other, I should have mentioned that the other constant is that there are unconstants. That is that historically, if we look at some of the suspicions and the like, that they change over time. So the suspicions about Jews and Catholics and Native Americans and Muslims and Mormons that we see in history in the United States, they morph over time. They take different forms according to the particular religious, political, and economic issues of the day. So in terms of, for Catholics, I look in the book two particular instances in 1834 in Charleston outside of Boston, and in 1844 in Philadelphia. And in both situations, you have a nativist response. So nativism is something that we often see associated with anti-religious sentiment.
Can you sort of describe for the benefit of our audience what nativism is?
Sure. So nativism is the self-awareness of certain groups of Americans that they are American, and that other groups, typically immigrant groups, are not truly American. And so nativism is something very similar to what we're seeing happening right now, where a majority group feel threatened by a group that they see as outsiders and not American. And so there's a very strong impulse then to say that we are natives and we stand for certain values, we stand for certain types of identity, and those people are a threat to that. So in 1834 and 1844 in Charlestown and in Philadelphia, you had very strong nativist sentiments around immigrant Irish Catholics, and also fears that were being cultivated by some sources, in no small part by newspapers, who were suggesting and circulating fears that these Irish Catholics were drunkards. In Charlestown at the time, the Irish Catholics and the Protestants had separate pubs and bars that they used to go to. So when you have that kind of separation, then that helps to kind of spur certain types of misinformation.
Sure.
There was also fears for Protestant girls, because actually the bishop, Catholic bishop at the time, had established a school in Charlestown, a convent school, and actually most of the children in that school, most of the girls were Protestant girls, because he was actually trying to cultivate better relationship with some of the Protestant elites and to demonstrate that actually Catholics weren't a threat. So he was trying to, in some ways, mainstream Catholicism and to help to demonstrate that Catholic Americans were no different than Protestant Americans. Well, unfortunately, in some ways that backfired. And because of these circulating fears about the threat to social order by supposedly drunk Irish Catholics, and the threat to Protestant girls that they were going to be forcibly converted. And then there was another fear toward women in terms of the nuns, that they were being held against their will. This is a long-standing Catholic, anti-Catholic sentiment that we see crop up in Protestant European history as well. And so all of this kind of converged at one point when there was a rumor that a nun had sought to escape from this convent and had been forcibly taken back by the bishop and by the mother in charge of the convent, which wasn't actually true. It was a misconstrual of a different situation. But the newspapers stoked it, and a group of people came and burned down the convent with the children, and the nuns were inside. They escaped happily, but it was quite severe.
Sure, and so the sort of the friction between the Protestants that were already there and the sort of Catholic, the Irish Catholics that were sort of migrating into those communities. Do you think it was primarily theological, the differences, and the sort of fear of conversion from one group to another, or were there also political and social or economic interests that were being threatened by this, that was then being sort of projected by newspapers or local media of the time?
That's right. It's in none of the circumstances that I examined was it purely a theological difference. Theological differences are often played upon in order to try to explain the difference and to project the notion of a danger, that it's systemic to that community because of their theological commitments. But in fact, in that case, for instance, there was a real fear among many of the Protestants of the Boston area that the economy was at threat, that their jobs were at threat, because at that time a great number of Bostonians were leaving Boston to go farther west to explore the opportunities that were there. And so the economy was stumbling a bit, and so the incursion of these immigrants posed a certain type of threat that way. And there were some other issues that were present at that time that made these nativists fear that this incursion of Irish Catholic immigrants were going to unstabilize their society.
Sure. Now, whether it was Jews or Catholics or Mormons or Quakers, there was a sense that they represented values that were antithetical to mainstream American values, perhaps by the nativists, right? And so, I would be interested to know, how did those what were those values that seemed to be so antithetical to American values? Again, what are American values? And then also, how did they then become mainstream? Because now, as a Muslim, when I see American society, I feel it's very Judeo-Christian in terms of its values. And so it's very interesting for me to think that there was a time when Jewish and Catholic values were perhaps considered antithetical.
Right.
And then, so how did they become mainstream? And or was it that the society then became more accepting? And what was that process?
So as a historian, I have to buck kind of American nationalist fervor to assume that there's American values that are eternal and never changing.
Right.
The history of the country demonstrates that that's not the case, and that we're constantly wrangling over what those values are. So for instance, there are a great many Americans today who believe that American values are Christian values, and that the founders of the country, the Constitution writers, were Christians through and through, and that they meant for Jesus to be kind of the leading spirit of this nation. Well, that is really an anachronistic projection from the people. The people who hold those beliefs, they're projecting their values backwards. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson, in his autobiography, was writing about the framing of the rights for Virginia, and somebody had suggested they put Jesus Christ into the language and of the state constitution, and it was voted down. And he made clear that what was important was that the Gentoo, as he said, and Muslims and Jews and Christians, and I think he put it, infidels of all denominations, should feel welcome there. So there's pluralism. There's not a Jesus-oriented kind of Christianity that's meant to be central to the values. At the same time, for Jefferson, what was most important for him wasn't that everybody be able to practice whatever religion they wanted, whatever rituals they wanted. He was more interested in conscience, the freedom of conscience, because he believed that democracy was reliant on the freedom of conscience of the individual, and that would allow that individual to be a good voting member of society. So
whatever religion that individual belonged to, Jefferson felt that as long as they were adhering to one particular religion, they would be guided by their conscience, and their conscience would be sort of dependent on that, on those values of that particular faith.
That's right, and there are some string of that has recurred in American history, where polls have demonstrated until fairly recently that many Americans are very suspicious of atheists and agnostics and would not vote for them to be president of the United States, where they would vote for Catholics, Jews, lesbians and gays, Muslims in far larger numbers. However, recently that the most recent polling of that has actually demonstrated that more Americans feel that atheists and agnostics are trustworthy as president rather than Muslims.
Right. Great. And so, how did those values, then become become mainstream? That with respect to Jews and Christians, or Catholics rather, they seemed to be antithetical, and they were sort of rejected by the mainstream. But then they became part of the mainstream. And how did that happen?
Yeah, I suppose I'm not sure it's really about their values, or it's really about the perception of their values and their practices. So what very often happens is that because of a certain constellation of social and political and economic issues, suddenly a group seems to be an outsider that is threatening either usually the social order of America, or at least a part of America. And so when in the early 19th century, there was particular fears that when Catholics arrived in this country, they were bringing the Pope with them, and that they would have this outside foreign influence that was going to manipulate Catholics, who were then going to kind of take over the American government. And in the early 19th century, or early 20th century rather, there were similar fears about what Henry Ford, the industrialist, called international Jewry, that there was this cabal of Jews around the world who were going to manipulate the United States. And in fact, Henry Ford believed that this cabal was responsible for the United States entering World War I, and which he was quite against. So I don't think it's really about the particular values that these groups hold. It's about the perceptions of the values, and then the recognition in time that they become more acceptable, because there's a recognition that the values actually are not a threat, and on better days there's a recognition actually that the values that religious groups that are accepted hold are often equally unusual to some sort of norm that some people project as being American.
Right. So based on your analysis of various faith communities and how they've been treated over time, what can we understand about the current state of anti-Muslim sentiment in the US and Islamophobia, and how is it similar or different from the experiences of previous communities, and what can we learn from history?
Well, it's similar in terms of that nativism, as we've seen over the last decade, unfortunately. There is a recurrent nativism that's being stoked for political purposes, and so we see it particularly heightening during the 2008, 2010, 2012 elections, and we're also seeing it again this year in 2016. So that unfortunate element is recurring, of course, in a particular historical moment, in its own particular form. So there are immigrant concerns regarding Mexicans, as has been elucidated, but also about Syrian refugees, and indeed about all Muslims. So the fact that it's being put that way demonstrates how Muslims are then being described as innately non-American, right? The idea that Mexicans and not Mexican Americans, right, are being described as being immigrants, okay, is one thing. But to describe Muslims, instead of saying non-American Muslims, right, as being a threat, and then kind of as a second order, suggesting that it's an immigrant threat, demonstrates how Muslims are seen by many Americans, unfortunately, as innately non-American, innately from abroad, even though we have generations and generations of Muslims in this country, and also that there's a threat that's emerging to the social order around issues around Shariaization, this kind of fictional notion that somehow Muslims are trying to project Islamic fiqh or Islamic law onto all Americans. So we have, again, that kind of notion of a disorder, but it's taking a particular form because of the historical moment we live in.
And also because of some of the very real, I guess, threats that people see or experience. I mean, 9/11, and then, there have been cases of homegrown sort of terrorism. And so I feel like that is sort of compounding that sense of fear and nativism. And so, I mean, do you think this is something particular then to Muslims that, that America is experiencing? Because with other groups, there wasn't that physical sort of threat, against, say, terrorism or things like that.
Well, in fact, if we look at the American kind of non-Native American attitude towards Native Americans, certainly in the 19th century, we do have that sort of notion of threat. There was antagonism that at times broke out into armed conflict. But in no way could that justify the kind of levels of violence and the degree of unfair laws and land grabs that happened. And that often circulated around religion. So one of really the cumulative event of federal violence against Native Americans at its most excessive was the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, which was sparked by federal officials being nervous about this thing called a ghost dance, which was actually taking off in many parts of the Midwest and Western United States among a variety of Native American communities, but particular fears around the Sioux, because the Sioux had been very successful in some ways of militarily resisting the federal encroachments on their land. And so, so there you have a friction, but because, again, of a misunderstanding and a lack of knowledge about the religious life of the Lakota and other Sioux, it led to a fear, an over response in terms of military presence, and then it led to this terrible disaster.
Right. So, I mean, how can we, is there anything in particular about Muslims and Islam that perpetuates negative perceptions about the community?
It's nothing innate to them. It's what's innate to the perceivers who assume that. You hear comments among various Americans that Islam requires Muslims to do this, or the Quran says you have to do that. And I think that's a real misreading of exactly how religious communities operate and work, where they're, even in a religious community like the Catholic Church, where you have, as opposed to Muslim communities, a very strict hierarchy that has a very centrally formed set of doctrines and canon that are expressed through that hierarchy. You have all sorts of dissents. You have all sorts of different expressions of that. You have all sorts of different cultural variables. And although many Catholics may say, well, the Bible says this, in fact, there's a myriad set of interpretations.
Right.
And so I think that what is happening with some of these Islamic individuals and groups, and there are professional Islamic groups out there that are deliberately spreading misinformation about Muslims as a threat, as well as certain
Islamophobic,
groups.
you mean?
Yeah.
Islamophobic groups, right?
Islamophobic groups.
Yeah.
That they are they are projecting this notion of kind of a monolithic Islam, and that all Muslims, if they're truly Muslim, must do these things or must believe these ways. And that's very similar to what we saw in anti-Mormon moments, anti-Catholic moments, anti-Jewish moments in American history.
Sure. So finally, I mean, and this is what your last chapter deals with, how can we do better?
Right, so as Americans, we need to learn from our history. We need to understand that these experiences have happened, and that even in the face of tremendous tragedies like the 9/11 tragedies and like the smaller but nevertheless horrible crimes that have happened occasionally since then, that we cannot just paint an entire group as being the enemy of Americans or of America. And so we have to recognize that there's diversity there. We have to understand that there is diversity not only of culture, but also of religious perception. And we have to understand our history, that in fact, although we have often cherished notions of religious pluralism, we have not always lived up to those values and to those ideas as they've changed over time. And so we have to be active in changing them for our time and to reaffirm what we consider to be the most important element of them.
So how do we change those perceptions? I mean, in the sort of wake, I mean, such an onslaught of sort of media projections about certain groups and, currently Muslims and other groups as well. I mean, how do we sort of then combat those stereotypes?
Right. Well, I think for non-Muslim Americans, it's pretty straightforward. If you have a concern about a particular group, then the web is a great resource, and there are a number of Muslim groups who put out their perspectives on the web, and very prominent groups like Islamic Society of North America or the Council for American and Islamic Relations, which comment on current events and which give their own responses and also give responses of other Muslims as well. There are ways of learning about Islamic traditions that are available as well, and education is a great way of going. Unfortunately, we're stymied because many public schools don't teach anything about religious traditions because of a fear that to teach about a religion is to teach religion.
Right.
And that's an unfortunate
There's no distinction between talking about religion and promoting religion.
That's right.
So because of First Amendment, guidelines, they feel like they can't talk about religion.
Right. In fact, there are many public schools, and fortunately increasing numbers of public universities that realize that actually we can teach students about religious traditions, about their histories, about their diversities, without actually promoting them.
Right.
And so we need to get better about doing that so that when students come through the system, they can actually learn something about these traditions and understand some of these diversities and have the intellectual tools to be able to ask questions and to figure out where to get information.
Absolutely. Well, we could go on, but thank you so much, Dr. Gottschalk. We're out of time, and we learned so much from your insights.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Until next time, this is your host, Mahlika Samdani.